yourself a little bit if you'd like.
Yeah, so I'm Sagen. I'm one of the violence prevention educators with Haven. So normally we go into lots of schools in the Seacoast area. We do K through 12 presentations. Obviously, that's looking a little bit different this year. So I've actually moved part-time to client services as well. So I'm answering the hotline 2 days a week.
Great.
And we can go right in.
All right. So tonight is going to be a lot of information coming at you. I'm just going to give you the heads up. Feel free to take notes and to ask questions in the chat section is great. And you may also find that when you ask a question as we go further along, you will have that answered. But don't be afraid to put one there just in case it doesn't get covered, and we can visit it in the end because we will have time to answer questions. And I just want everybody to know everyone has different styles of learning. One is experiential, and it equals learning by doing. We have different opportunities, including role plays and activities to help you gain understanding on that level. These activities help us understand what it is that survivors of abuse may be feeling, thinking, and needing. These may be upsetting for people, especially if you have a trauma history. So we want to help you understand the dynamics and challenge you to manage and cope with the feelings that may come up. This will also help you to manage and cope with feelings that may come up as you begin doing advocacy with survivors of trauma. Please reach out to us if you need to process. So we are going to be having pretty heavy discussions about domestic violence and sexual assault. And so if at any time something comes up for you and you feel like you need to process and talk through it, after tonight, I'll give you guys my phone number, and then staff backup who is on call tonight. Also, her name is Hannah. I will give some of you her number and some of you my number. And if you need to talk, we will be available till 9:30 tonight. But again, if something comes up, tomorrow even, if you've had time to think about it tonight, please reach out to me tomorrow during the day. You can call me anytime during the day tomorrow. All right.
Okay, awesome. Let's do this. So like Kyla said, we're going to be discussing some pretty weighty topics tonight, like domestic violence and stalking and sexual assault. My goal tonight is to give you some tools that you're going to need as advocates to understand and empathize with and support the clients that you're going to be working with soon. We'll discuss some of the language that we as a society use when we're speaking about these types of violence, and the impact that that can have on both victims and perpetrators. We'll also be breaking down some myths around abuse and talk about some strategies such as safety planning. So we'll jump right into the domestic violence section. So what is domestic violence? Domestic literally means within the home, but there's a broader definition than that. It could be within a family, like a couple, or between parents and children, or even between children, like with siblings or step siblings. It can also refer to violence that takes place within an intimate relationship, even if they don't live together. When people hear the word violence, they often think of physical violence, but it can also be sexual, verbal, emotional, or economical. What makes the violence domestic violence is the drive behind it. And that's when one person is using that violence to gain or maintain power and control over another person. It also tends to occur in an ongoing pattern. Domestic violence is rarely a one-time event. And not only does it happen over and over, it actually increases in frequency and severity over time. Before we delve further into domestic violence, let's talk about some statistics to get everyone some perspective on the scope of the matter. So keep in mind that these statistics aren't always entirely accurate, and that's due to the issue of some pretty significant underreporting when it comes to these crimes. And we'll talk more about why so many instances of domestic violence and sexual assault go unreported a little bit later. First stat, 3 women a day are murdered by their partners in the US. And that's actually an older statistic. So the number is currently closer to 4 women a day, which means that the problem is getting worse. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men have been physically assaulted by an intimate partner at some point in their life. So those numbers refer to physical assault, which is physical contact, but not sexual contact. Those figures are different, and we will get to those later. 40% of gay men, 46% of lesbians, and 75% of bisexual women will experience sexual violence at some point in their lives. Those numbers are shockingly high, and LGBTQ folks are often underserved for many reasons. I got these stats from the CDC's website. In 2018, they did a national survey about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and I really recommend taking a look if you're. And intimate partner homicide is the leading cause of death for pregnant women in the US. Most of these homicides take place in the first 3 months of pregnancy, and most of them are carried out with a firearm. Gun violence is a huge issue in our country right now, and the impact on victims of domestic violence is clear. So why are all of these numbers so high? We at Haven believe that part of the reason is the language that we as a society use when we talk about these issues and the way that victims are treated. So we're going to do a little bit of a word exercise. John beat Mary. That is a perfectly fine English sentence. There's a subject, a verb, and an object, the subject being John. Mary was beaten by John. One could argue that this message is the same as the first one. I disagree. Would anyone like to say anything about why this is different than the first? Raise your hand if you can give me any feedback.
I saw a couple hands. I saw Olivia and Kate C.
Yeah, I'll go. It's because it makes John the object rather than Mary. So it puts Mary in a position of almost authority in the sentence as a word.
Yeah, you're incredibly right. So like Mary is now the subject of the sentence. So the focus has shifted from John to Mary. You're completely right. Next one, Mary was beaten. John is no longer part of the conversation. And the last one, Mary is a battered woman. Not only is John now no longer part of the conversation, but Mary now has a new identity. No longer something that happened to her, it's now who she is as a person. What do you think of that? Anybody?
It's labeling her. Now she's been labeled.
It is a label, yeah. It's like part of her identity now. And it also removes all responsibility and even acknowledgement from John, who was the cause of what happened. And this isn't the only instance of language causing harm to victims or absolving perpetrators of their choices. So using phrases like an epidemic of abuse. I'm sure we've all heard that phrase, but it's not like there's like particles of domestic violence just like floating around in the air that we can walk through and then we like catch it. Like, no, it's a choice that people are making. And using the phrase accusers instead of victims when we're talking about that is kind of like a public thing. So we as the public are now positioned to identify sympathetically with the perpetrator as the victim of the survivor's accusations rather than with the survivor. So it discourages people from coming forward. And if we really want to end abuse, we need to place responsibility where it belongs, which is on the perpetrators. So before we move on and talk more about these different kinds of abuse, I want to know what you think. So we're going to break you into a couple breakout rooms and you're going to brainstorm different types of abuse. So feel free to come up with some examples, like to kind of, instead of just saying like physical, you can say what makes it physical abuse or something. So it's gonna be really short. I'm only gonna keep you in the rooms for about 2 minutes and then we'll come back and discuss briefly.
All right, and we'll set those up.
Awesome, thank you.
To be random and
Totally random.
All right.
Everybody go to your room.
Yeah. Did Anne and Aaron not get rooms?
And did you get an invitation to a room?
Oh,
Oh.
there she goes.
She's
She's
gone.
just. Aaron, did you get an invitation?
She gone.
There
Oh.
she goes.
There she goes. Yay.
All right.
Mm.
I don't know
Sage,
what
you are so awesome.
she is. That she is. I might give Erin Luckern a call.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, let me pull up her phone number. Because that's weird. She did not. Oh.
She's
And
not.
I,
Okay.
she's not what?
She's not NAVAP.
No. There it is. 603 973. I hate when phone numbers are written down with no punctuation between the.
Oh, yes.
All right.
Okay.
I'm going to mute myself and give her a call while you guys.
Okay.
Are you all right with that? I'll
Yeah.
make sure everything's all right.
You look very fancy, Sagen. I wasn't going to say anything because
She
nobody else
does
knew
with the
that you were
lipstick.
wearing your.
I literally just put my hair up and put lipstick on and put on like
So-
an actual shirt.
Will you
Actual
clean
shirt.
up real nice?
Oh, thanks.
I'll be right back. I'm going to give her a call and make
Mhm.
sure everything's all right.
It's crazy what lipstick does. Like it's like
Yes.
no effort and it changes your whole face. Like I didn't put any more makeup on than I had earlier when we were talking.
It is. I should remember that because, like, when I literally just put on mascara and lipstick, it's like, oh,
Mhm.
why don't I just do this? Because then I look like a real human who's going out on a date or something.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. People should be probably coming back relatively shortly.
Did you close the rooms?
I don't think I can do that. I think Kyla has to do that. I
Oh, Kyla does have to do that.
think it's time.
Okay. Kyla? Oh no, she's on the phone. Oh no.
Can you do it?
Okay. I can't because I'm not a host.
Kyla.
So, Kyla, she's not looking even a little bit. Kyla, hey, you. No, for real, you. Okay. Did we close us some breakout rooms?
I don't know.
Hi, sorry, we can't close the breakout rooms. Hold on.
I was muted.
Here.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I don't see the thing. The breakout room thing is gone.
Oh no.
Are they just gone?
Oh, wait,
for-
there it is. It was because I made my screen smaller.
Okay.
All room. All right, they have 60 seconds. Sorry about that. I was like, why
That's
are they waving at me?
Okay. So they were in there a little long. Okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. We'll have excellent lists.
Yep.
Patricia, you made it back. You're the first. You win.
Erin Luckern is joining us. She just was on her way home from Portsmouth and the weather was a little bad, she said.
Oh, yes.
So she'll be here in a little bit.
Excellent.
Is Haley here yet? I can't see everybody. So.
I
Not yet.
haven't let her in.
Okay.
Do you want me to call her as well?
No, I just
I think
didn't know
she'll-
if she was here yet.
There we go. And everybody's faces are back from their rooms.
All right. Are we waiting for people to answer what types of abuse they came up
I
with?
don't know if everyone was back yet. I can't see.
I think so.
Oh, yes, I think
Back?
so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think everybody's back.
So would anyone like to volunteer part of their list that they were able to compile?
A volunteer.
Yeah.
Yep.
We came up with intimidation, financial, psychological, threats,
Mhm.
physical, sexual, child abuse, sleep deprivation, food limitations, gaslighting, and stalking.
That is so thorough. Thank you for that.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's really thorough.
Does anyone have anything that wasn't on that list that they would add before we move on and kind of like delve further into those?
We also discussed, I think, and maybe you said this, but the threat of taking away the kids. We talked about a lot of different threats and intimidations,
Mm-hmm.
but taking away the kids as well, or threatening to show people that, or to abuse the kids and blame it on the other person.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Anyone else want to add anything before we move on?
We also talked about isolation from family and friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about these a little bit more. Oop, if it goes. There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to make sure that everyone has a really broad understanding of what abuse can look like is so that you as advocates can pass that information along to clients that you'll be working with. So this is the power and control wheel. There's obviously a lot of tiny words, like a lot of information going on here. We won't discuss all of it right now. I believe that you'll be getting this as well. Like,
It should be in their resource guide.
yeah, this is great. So oftentimes clients won't recognize certain tactics that their abuser is using as abuse. But you can tell the client if they block an exit to the room with their body so that you can't leave, that is abuse, and no one deserves to be treated that way. Sometimes an abuser who has never committed a physical act of violence against their victim, but uses intimidation and threats or isolation or control might say, but I've never laid a hand on you, so it's not abuse. And you can tell the client otherwise. And by giving this information to clients, you can empower them to make informed decisions for themselves. So just really quickly, I'll go around the wheel. So a lot of people said that they talked about intimidation, and that's a really big one. So what's happening? Nothing. Okay. So making someone feel afraid, that's what intimidation is. So that can just be looks and gestures, smashing things, hurting a pet or something like that, or like displaying weapons. Emotional abuse would be like putting someone down, humiliating them, or kind of like taking advantage of someone's like internalized phobias and stuff like that. Using isolation is a big one, making sure that they're kind of the only one in their victim's life that they can kind of count on and rely on, controlling who you talk to, the way that you talk to them, not letting you go places alone. Denying, minimizing, and blaming, I would say, is what, was it Kristen who said gaslighting? I think it was, yeah. So gaslighting would kind of fall under that category, like making light of it or saying that it didn't happen or shifting the responsibility of that. And then using children, like another person said. So making you feel guilty about the children or using the children to like relay messages that would not be appropriate for them to relay because that's not their job as children. Or threatening to have the kids taken away. And then using privilege. And obviously the word privilege is like very prevalent in our society right now, but the way that we're using it in this way is like kind of treating someone like they're lesser than you, making all of the big decisions in the relationship, knowing what's best for you and the relationship. And then economic abuse can kind of go both ways, where it can both mean not allowing someone to have or keep a job, or asking for money all the time, or not letting you have your own money, or making them give you all their money. Yeah, so it can go both ways. And then coercion and threats. So even just making threats, if you never carry them out, that's still considered abuse. And it's used to frighten someone and have control in that way. So let's move on to breaking down some myths about abusers and why people abuse. I've heard some of these said not only by abusers, but by most people, and even victims and survivors sometimes uses for the abusers in their lives with these things that we're about to talk about. And it's so important to dispel these myths in order to get to the true root of the cause. So the first one I want to talk about is anger management and loss of control. I feel like this one's most often used by abusers. And what they say is, I just get so angry, I can't help myself. It's not my fault. I lost control. Let me ask you this. That person who gets angry or frustrated and hits their partner or their children, sorry, my throat is like doing a weird thing right now. Do you think that they ever feel angry or frustrated while at work? Yes.
Yes.
Lots of people feel stress or frustration when they're at work. Do you think that that same person who, when they feel angry or frustrated and hit their partner or their children, do you think that they hit their boss when they're feeling angry at work?
No.
No, they don't. Why do you think that is? Someone just feel free to just chime in.
Boss has the control.
The boss has the control. Yeah, there would be consequences for their actions. Their boss has more power than them. So let me ask you another question. That person who hits their partners or their kids, do they do it at the grocery store or in line at the bank?
No.
No, where do they do it?
Privacy at home, usually.
They do it at home, and it's for the reason that you said it's private. There aren't any witnesses there. They won't face consequences. And if there are witnesses there, they're probably scared too, and they're not going to say or do anything. So if they are choosing the person that they're abusing, and they're choosing the where and when that they're abusing them, does that sound like losing control to you? No, that sounds like a choice that they're making. So we say that abuse isn't about losing control. It's about having control. The next one is substance use disorders. So can substances heighten situations and feelings? Yeah, of course they can. But they don't cause abuse to happen out of nowhere. So I like to highlight this with a story about a man who was in a sort of program for people who had abused their partners when they were under the influence. The police were interviewing him, and they asked him, do you hit your wife because you drank? And the man was very honest, and he said, no, I drank so I can hit my wife. So what was drinking for him?
Breaking down of barriers, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. It was like an excuse. It was like permission for him to do what it was that he wanted to do. And think about it this way. Are there people out there who do have substance use disorders who have never abused anyone? Yeah, there are a lot of them, in fact. And do you think that there are people out there who have been stone cold sober and been very abusive? Absolutely. The next one can be a little bit sticky for people. So we do know that abuse is a choice, but not all instances of violence are abusive. So let's say there's someone with PTSD or a mental illness that causes them to be detached from reality, and they lash out violently when they're scared and confused. That would not be considered abuse because they don't know what's happening around. So would they be just as likely to lash out violently if they're terrified and they don't know what's going on in public as they are at home? Yeah. And are they just as likely to do it with anyone who's around them, regardless of their power stature? Yeah, they would. And that's what makes it not domestic violence, is because it's not about power and control. But if someone has a mental illness or says they have a mental illness and they're using that as an excuse to hurt someone, then that is absolutely domestic violence. And I want to make sure that I make a note that if someone is hurting people around them, when they're detached from reality, whether or not they're meaning to hurt those people, that's still not okay. And they would still be responsible for getting help for that so that they stop hurting people. Family history. So this is another difficult one because we know that there is a correlation. A little less than a third of people who were abused as children do become abusers themselves, but as we know, abuse is a choice. We also know that men are more often physically abusive than women, but is that because they are men? No, of course not. And it's normal for survivors to experience frustration and anger and resentment around what happened to them, but it's never okay for them to then take those feelings out on other people or to try to take back the control that was taken from them by having control over others. It would be the responsibility of that person to seek out help and work through those feelings. Abuse is always a choice, and it comes from a place of I have a right to hurt. But what about mutual abuse? I don't know if anyone has ever heard this term. I certainly have. So who here's ever heard someone say like, but they abuse each other, it's mutual abuse, or X is just as bad as Y, it's a toxic. So I'm gonna tell you right now, mutual abuse is a myth. Because when you're using the word mutual, it implies equal power and a level playing field. I'll watch a cute little video. So obviously this is like a super cute cat video and it does not depict the actual nature of what abuse looks like. But I like to use the video to make some points. So did the kitten start it? Yes. Did the other cat use much more force? Obviously. And the other cat is also a lot bigger. So when police show up to a domestic violence call and both parties have used violence, they're supposed to determine who the predominant aggressor is. And the predominant aggressor is the one whose actions show a pattern of controlling or threatening or hurtful behavior. So they want to find out who in the situation has the control. Do you ever think that there are times when a victim might use physical aggression against their abuser? Yeah. Yes, it does. It does happen. But that's not mutual abuse. So when a victim uses violence against their abuser, it's called like resistive or reactive violence. It's for a different reason, so it's not. So can anyone think of an example of a time when a victim might use resistive or reactive violence against their abuser? It doesn't have to be like in super great detail or anything.
Protect themselves.
Yeah, to protect themselves, like self-defense. So I made a little list of those times. So to escape or stop violence against them, for example, if an abuser's blocking a doorway with their body and not allowing the victim to leave, and the victim pushes them down or pushes them out of the way, or if the abuser's like menacingly coming toward them and they throw things at them to keep them away. And then to protect children, family members, and pets against escalating abuse. So sometimes a caller will say something like, they hit me for years and I never raised a hand against them. But when they hit my child, it was a different story. And then also sometimes a victim might attack an abuser who's hurting another member of the family to draw them away and protect that family member by taking the abuse themselves. Resistance to ongoing abuse is what Anne said. So in other words, like self-defense. And then this last one can be weird for some people. So it says, in the cycle of abuse, a survivor might attempt to set off the abuser on purpose at a point when the abuser is less lethal. So that can be hard for people to wrap their head around. And there are times that are safer than others. And I'd like for everyone to earmark this because I want to come back to it when we talk about the cycle of abuse a little bit later. So back to mutual abuse. What does mutual fighting actually look like? MMA fighting, two people agreeing to fight each other at a bar, which by the way is still illegal, so don't do that. But when we're talking about like MMA and boxing, are there rules about size? Absolutely. Fighters are actually usually like really meticulous about their size and weight so that they stay in their preferred weight class. And what about the tactics they use? People can't use like eye gouges or hit each other in the groin. And can you imagine like if one fighter was allowed to use a knife and another one wasn't? That would be insane. So all of this is to ensure that the playing field is as level as possible and make sure that it's like what's called a fair fight. So when police do show up to a domestic violence call where both people have been using violence against each other, they look for things to figure out who the victim is. So victims fear their partner, fear retribution, and they have empathy for their partner still, trying to explain their partner's behavior and see the relationship from their perspective, and even kind of thinking about the way that they've contributed to the violence, even though they haven't. And abusers do the exact opposite. They don't fear their partner or retribution. They criticize and blame their partner and put all the focus on their partner's behavior. And they are either unable or unwilling to have empathy. So there are definitely some myths around what abuse looks like and who it happens to. So what does the stereotypical victim of intimate partner violence look like? Who are they? Anyone feel free to jump.
There isn't a stereotypical, is there?
What was that?
I don't think that there's any stereotypical picture of victims.
Yeah, well, we know that obviously victims can be anybody, but there does tend to be a stereotype on who the kind of person who is the victim in an intimate partner violence relationship is.
Particularly, I know like a lot of people, I'm a little bit of a crime show junkie, or was for a really long time. And so I find it helpful to think about like how were victims of domestic violence shown on television shows, like on crime shows like CSI or Law and Order, because you tend to see the same archetype sort of over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe low self-esteem, timid.
Yep,
It's also almost always a woman too.
it is almost exclusively.
I
I
feel
feel
like
like it's also probably like minority or people who are of lower economic status.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Are they usually straight as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, almost all the time. I don't think I've ever seen that on TV with like not heteronormative relationship. So yeah, they're usually young as well. They're usually young, poor or middle class, female, straight. And we know that the reality of the situation is victims are diverse just like perpetrators. And if a victim's situation doesn't fit that stereotype, they can actually face some unique barriers in getting the help that they need. Like if a wealthy man who has a powerful job is being abused, he might fear not being believed or even being made fun of. Or if someone is in a relationship that isn't heteronormative, they might feel as though they can't seek help without like outing themselves or their partner, or even like tarnishing gay relationships somehow, which is a thing that we have actually heard people say. And perpetrators will actually capitalize on those barriers and take advantage of them. We often hear survivors say, I never thought that I was the type of person this would happen to. Are you all familiar with the frog in the boiling water analogy?
Mm.
I'm going to talk about it anyway, even though you all seem to know what it is. So if you toss a frog in a pot of boiling water, it will immediately jump out, and then you have a scalded frog hopping around your kitchen, which is not fun. But if you place a frog in a pot of cool water and then you gradually turn up the heat, the frog won't notice until it's too late and it's cooked. And the same principle can be applied to abusive relationships. So abusers are not abusive on the first date or the second or the third, usually. Quite the opposite most of the time. They can be very charming, and they go through a process of like wooing and seducing their victim. And the pattern of abuse is really gradual. And once it becomes explosive, it's not a one-time thing. And the abuse becomes more frequent and severe over time. And we hear he never hit me until we got married, I got pregnant, we bought a house together. In other words, when it becomes much more difficult to leave the situation. Now that the victim is trapped, the cycle of abuse begins. So this is the cycle represented with clouds and suns. So there's an eye of the storm phase. And during this phase, everything's fine. If abuse has occurred in the past, it's usually not talked about, and the abuser might act like it didn't happen. And then comes the tension building phase. And that's when the abuser starts to increase in anger and jealousy. They might become really controlling. Many survivors say that this phase is even worse than the abuse. That waiting for the other shoe to drop feeling can be terrifying and exhausting. They often feel like they need to walk on eggshells around their partner in order to prevent them from exploding into the violent phase. And do you remember a few slides back when we talked about when a victim might purposely provoke an abuser? And I asked you to remember, this is when it's happening. So for some victims, especially those who have been through this cycle many times, will set off their abuser as close to the beginning of the tension building phase as possible, so that the abuser hasn't had the opportunity to like build up all this negative energy to use against them. And it can sometimes be safer for them that way. And then comes the violence phase. And this is when the abuse happens. So victims are traumatized and they may reach out for help from friends or family or advocates. So we most often get calls during this phase. And then the makeup phase, also known as the honeymoon phase. The abuser apologizes for what they've done. They might buy gifts or do acts of service. They say that they'll change and it'll never happen again. But what happens again? It happens again, over and over and over and over again. And this leads us to the age-old question. Why don't victims just leave? There is a problem with asking this sort of question. It puts responsibility to end the abuse on the victim when it should be with the abuser. So I'd actually like for us to watch a video now. It's of Leslie Morgan Steiner, and she's giving a TED Talk, and she gives us some insight into why victims often don't leave. It's a really, really powerful talk. So if everyone can make sure that they're muted so we don't get the weird feedback stuff. And I am also going to do that.
I'm here today to talk about a disturbing question, which has an equally disturbing answer. My topic is the secrets of domestic violence. And the question I'm going to tackle is the one question everyone always asks. Why does she stay? Why would anyone stay with a man who beats her? I'm not a psychiatrist, a social worker, or an expert in domestic violence. I'm just one woman with a story to tell. I was 22. I had just graduated from Harvard College. I'd moved to New York City for my first job as a writer and editor at 17 magazine. I had my first apartment, my first little green American Express card, and I had a very big secret. My secret was that I had this gun, loaded with hollow point bullets, pointed at my head by the man who I thought was my soulmate, many, many times. The man who I loved more than anybody on earth held a gun to my head and threatened to kill me more times than I can even remember. I'm here to tell you the story of crazy love, a psychological trap disguised as love, one that millions of women and even a few men fall into every year. It may even be your story. I don't look like a typical domestic violence survivor. I have a BA in English from Harvard College, an MBA in marketing from Wharton Business School. I spent most of my career working for Fortune 500 companies, including Johnson & Johnson, Leo Burnett, and the Washington Post. I've been married for almost 20 years to my second husband, and we have 3 kids together. My dog is a black lab, and I drive a Honda Odyssey minivan. So my first message for you is that domestic violence happens to everyone. All races, all religions, all income and education levels. It's everywhere. And my second message is that everyone thinks domestic violence happens to women, that it's a women's issue. Not exactly. Over 85% of abusers are men. And domestic abuse happens only in intimate, interdependent, long-term relationships. In other words, in families. The last place we would want or expect to find violence, which is one reason domestic abuse is so confusing. I would have told you myself that I was the last person on earth who would stay with a man who beats me. But in fact, I was a very typical victim because of my age. I was 22. And in the United States, women ages 16 to 24 are 3 times as likely to be domestic violence victims as women of other ages. And over 500 women and girls this age are killed every year by abusive partners, boyfriends and husbands in the United States. I was also a very typical victim because I knew nothing about domestic violence, its warning signs or its patterns. I met Connor on a cold, rainy January night. He sat next to me on the New York City subway, and he started chatting me up. He told me 2 things. One was that he too had just graduated from an Ivy League school, and that he worked at a very impressive Wall Street bank. But what made the biggest impression on me that first meeting was that he was smart and funny, and he looked like a farm boy. He had these big cheeks, these big apple cheeks, and this wheat blonde hair, and he seemed so sweet. One of the smartest things Connor did from the very beginning was to create the illusion that I was the dominant partner in the relationship. He did this, especially at the beginning, by idolizing me. We started dating, and he loved everything about me. That I was smart, that I'd gone to Harvard, that I was passionate about helping teenage girls and my job. He wanted to know everything about my family and my childhood, my hopes and dreams. Connor believed in me as a writer and a woman in a way that no one else ever had. And he also created a magical atmosphere of trust between us by confessing his secret, which was that as a very young boy, starting at age 4, he had been savagely and repeatedly physically abused by his stepfather. And the abuse had gotten so bad that he had had to drop out of school in 8th grade, even though he was very smart. And he'd spent almost 20 years rebuilding his life, which is why that Ivy League degree and the Wall Street job and his bright, shiny future meant so much to him. If you had told me that this smart, funny, sensitive man who adored me would one day dictate whether or not I wore makeup, how short my skirts were, where I lived, what jobs I took, who my friends were, and where I spent Christmas, I would have laughed at you. Because there was not a hint of violence or control or anger in Connor at the beginning. I didn't know that the first stage in any domestic violence relationship is to seduce and charm the victim. I also didn't know that the second step is to isolate the victim. Now, Connor did not come home one day and announce, you know, hey, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff has been great, but I need to move into the next phase where I isolate you and I abuse you. So I need to get you out of this apartment where the neighbors can hear you scream, and out of this city where you have friends and family and coworkers who can see the bruises. Instead, Connor came home one Friday evening, and he told me that he had quit his job that day, his dream job. And he said that he had quit his job because of me, because I had made him feel so safe and loved that he didn't need to prove himself on Wall Street anymore. And he just wanted to get out of the city and away from his abusive, dysfunctional family and move to a tiny town in New England where he could start his life over with me by his side. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was leave New York and my dream job. But I thought you made sacrifices for your soulmate. So I agreed, and I quit my job, and Connor and I left Manhattan together. I had no idea I was falling into crazy love, that I was walking headfirst into a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap. The next step in the domestic violence pattern is to introduce the threat of violence and see how she reacts. And here's where those guns come in. As soon as we moved to New England, you know that place where Connor was supposed to feel so safe? He bought 3 guns. He kept one in the glove compartment of our car. He kept one under the pillows on our bed. And the third one he kept in his pocket at all times. And he said that he needed those guns because of the trauma he'd experienced as a young boy. He needed them to feel protected. But those guns were really a message for me. And even though he hadn't raised a hand to me, my life was already in grave danger every minute of every day. Connor first physically attacked me 5 days before our wedding. It was 7 a.m. I still had on my nightgown. I was working on my computer trying to finish a freelance writing assignment, and I got frustrated. And Connor used my anger as an excuse to put both of his hands around my neck and to squeeze so tightly that I could not breathe or scream. And he used the chokehold to hit my head repeatedly against the wall. 5 days later, the 10 bruises on my neck had just faded, and I put on my mother's wedding dress, and I married him. Despite what had happened, I was sure we were going to live happily ever after, because I loved him, and he loved me so much. And he was very, very sorry. He had just been really stressed out by the wedding and by becoming a family with me. It was an isolated incident, and he was never going to hurt me again. It happened twice more on the honeymoon. The first time, I was driving to find a secret beach, and I got lost. And he punched me in the side of my head so hard that the other side of my head repeatedly hit the driver's side window. And then a few days later, driving home from our honeymoon, he got frustrated by traffic, and he threw a cold Big Mac in my face. Connor proceeded to beat me once or twice a week for the next 2.5 years of our marriage. I was mistaken in thinking that I was unique and alone in this situation. 1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life. And the CDC reports that 15 million children are abused every year. 15 million. So actually, I was in very good company. Back to my question. Why did I stay? The answer is easy. I didn't know he was abusing me. Even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me downstairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? Why didn't I walk out? I could have left any time. To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask, because we victims know something you usually don't. It's incredibly dangerous to leave an abuser, because the final step in the domestic violence pattern is kill her. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose. Other outcomes include long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries, denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family court system to terrify the victim and her children, who are regularly forced by family court judges to spend unsupervised time with the man who beat their mother. And still we ask, why doesn't she just leave? I was able to leave because of one final sadistic beating that broke through my denial. I realized that the man who I loved so much was going to kill me if I let him. So I broke the silence. I told everyone. The police, my neighbors, my friends and family, total strangers. And I'm here today because you all helped me. We tend to stereotype victims as grisly headlines, self-destructive women, damaged goods. The question, why does she stay, is code for some people for it's her fault for staying. As if victims intentionally choose to fall in love with men intent upon destroying us. But since publishing Crazy Love, I have heard hundreds of stories from men and women who also got out, who learned an invaluable life lesson from what happened, and who rebuilt lives, joyous, happy lives, as employees, wives, and mothers, lives completely free of violence. Like me. Because it turns out that I'm actually a very typical domestic violence victim and a typical domestic violence survivor. I remarried a kind and gentle man. We have those 3 kids. I have that black lab and I have that minivan. What I will never have again, ever, is a loaded gun held to my head by someone who says that he loves me. Now, right now, maybe you're thinking, wow, this is fascinating. Or, wow, how stupid was she? But this whole time, I've actually been talking about you. I promise you, there are several people listening to me right now who are currently being abused, or who were abused as children, or who are abusers themselves. Abuse could be affecting your daughter, your sister, your best friend right now. I was able to end my own crazy love story by breaking the silence. I'm still breaking the silence today. It's my way of helping other victims. And it's my final request of you. Talk about what you heard here. Abuse thrives only in silence. You have the power to end domestic violence simply by shining a spotlight on it. We victims need everyone. We need every one of you to understand the secrets of domestic violence. Show abuse the light of day by talking about it with your children, your coworkers, your friends and family. Recast survivors as wonderful, lovable people with full futures. Recognize the early signs of violence and conscientiously intervene, de-escalate it, show victims a safe way out. Together, we can make our beds, our dinner tables, and our families the safe and peaceful oases they should be. Thank you.
All right, here we go. Let me just do one thing. There we go. Okay, so obviously that's a really, really powerful thing that we just watched. And I think it's a really important thing for people to watch, everybody, but especially we as advocates. She gives so much insight into what victims might be thinking and the reality of living with that kind of abuse. And Leslie spoke on some of the risks of leaving and how leaving is often the most dangerous time. And I'd like to speak a little bit more on those risks and how weighing the risks of staying or leaving can be really, really overwhelming for victims. So if I stay for work, come on, do the thing. There we go. So it did the thing. They risk injury, not just physical, but mental and emotional injuries as well, which are, in my opinion, equally as important as those physical injuries. Isolation, risk of children being hurt, fear of losing custody of those children, mental health issues, which can be ongoing, and financial abuse and poverty. And the risks of leaving are the same. They're identical, with a few very, very small variations. So leaving is the most dangerous time, so that risk of injury is there. Isolation can continue after the abuser leaves if they isolated that person thoroughly enough, or like moved them across the country or something like that. The risk of children being hurt is still there because visitation is pretty likely. Custody battles, those same mental health issues, financial abuse in the form of not paying court-ordered bills or child support, and poverty and homelessness. And domestic violence is actually the leading cause of homelessness in America. So we know that there is no such thing as just leaving. It's a very delicate process. And many of those risks that we talked about act as barriers, keeping someone trapped or forcing them back once they do leave, especially that homelessness that we talked about. This doesn't mean that survivors can't leave, but safety planning is so crucial. And that's where you as advocates come in. There's often a final straw moment when victims reach out for help. And Haven offers support to help break down some of those barriers that we talked about. Help with emergency shelter, with long-term housing services. We can get victims in touch with legal services and medical providers. We can help clients obtain protective orders, or if they're not ready to leave or leaving isn't their safest option, we can safety plan with them. And sometimes our work is planting seeds in people's minds, letting them know that the door is always open. It can take a long time for someone to leave, or to leave permanently. Most survivors leave an average of 7 times before leaving for good. And this can feel frustrating as an advocate, but it's important to remember that the client knows their situation best, and our job is to empower them to make these decisions for themselves. Let's move on to stalking. I'm just gonna like chug water really fast. Okay. So talking about stalking. So people often use the word stalking without truly knowing what it means. So, oh, that's not what I want. Okay. We have all heard the term Facebook stalking, or envisioned like a shadowy stranger behind corners, but stalking looks very different for many people. So stalking, as defined by the state of New Hampshire, is right here. It's pretty wordy. It's legalese, as we like to say. So in addition to what is written on the slide here, stalking can also be like violations of protective orders or divorce decrees or bail conditions. And stalking can be perpetrated by intimate partners, acquaintances, or strangers, though being stalked by a stranger is actually quite rare. So let's look at some statistics. 7.5 million people are stalked in the United States every year. The majority of them are stalked by someone that they know, like I just mentioned. 1% of females and 44% of males are stalked by a current or former intimate partner, and 25% of females and 32% of males are stalked by an acquaintance. 11% of stalking victims have been stalked for 5 or more years. So I'm sure we could all use a little bit more clarification on what exactly constitutes stalking, because the New Hampshire definition, again, isn't the most clear thing in the world. In short terms, it's any unwanted behavior that's meant to cause fear. So here's a pretty comprehensive list. Constant calling, texting, emailing, leaving unwanted gifts, tracking, following, or showing up places that they frequent, threatening a person or people in their household, damaging a person's property, monitoring their phone or computer use, and posting false or private information about the victim on the internet or in public places, which is also known as doxing. So some victims might experience 1 or 2 of these behaviors, which in my opinion, 1 is enough, but some may experience everything on this list. So like, can you imagine how that would even feel? So victims of stalking often say that they often feel afraid and anxious being an understatement, and they feel like they might be going crazy or that they're being paranoid at times. And after some time, they might start to feel exhausted and hopeless. And if they've had to change their routines in order to avoid their stalker, They might feel isolated from friends and family and from the rest of the world. So we're actually about to watch another video of Valerie Wynn. She is the founder of the Mary Parrish Center in Nashville, Tennessee, and they're an organization that provides housing to victims and their families. But she's also a survivor of stalking herself. So, up here. And if everyone can mute, or if Sarah or Kyla can mute everybody.
Yep, I can do that.
Thank you.
And we broke up over the phone. It wasn't even a breakup, you know, because it wasn't really a relationship. It was a very brief affair, I guess. It was a quick dating relationship. And he was fine over the phone. I said, you know, I told you this might happen. And he said, that's okay. And then he appeared at my apartment. And he said, I'd left a few things in your apartment. Do you mind if I get them? And I said, no. And he came up, and I was standing in the bathroom, and I was washing my face, and he was standing at the bathroom door, and he said something, and I was half asleep, but water on my face. And he said, this isn't what you want to do. And then the next thing I know, I was flying through the air. And I'm telling you, I don't care how strong you are, whether you're a male or a female, when someone hits you with the full force of their weight and you are unprepared for it, there's no coming back from that. There was not even a question that I could even defend myself, because he, you know, years later, when I became an advocate, I had to learn how to safety plan with women. And one of the things we do is we not only safety plan after they leave, we safety plan when they're in the situation. So I've walked many women through where not to be assaulted. So when you say to a woman, if you know he's getting ready to assault you, you know, back out of the kitchen, don't go in the bathroom, back into the bedroom. And that seems really counterintuitive, but the thing about a bedroom is if I throw you across the room, there's a really good chance you're going to hit the biggest thing in the room, which is the bed. So you'll be soft and maybe relatively safe. One of the worst rooms you can get assaulted in is a bathroom, because everything you hit is going to be hard, and that's exactly what happened to me. So I ended up in the bathtub, and I kept losing consciousness, and he meant to kill me. He was strangling me and was telling me, you're going to die. Like, it was clear. And I truly, honestly felt at that moment that I was going to die. I had no doubt in my mind. When I came to, he was straddling me, and I could tell by his face that he thought he'd killed me. And it kind of shocked him back into reality. So, long story short, I was very injured. I had several broken ribs. I had a broken nose. Blood was everywhere. You know, this is unpleasant, but it's part of the story. I had urinated during the assault, and that had mixed with blood, and I had no idea how injured I was, because it was hard to figure out. Anyway, finally I was able to escape from the apartment. And at the time, this was in the late 70s in Philadelphia, there was no domestic violence laws. So the police officers, when they came, said, well, you were dating him, yes. You were having consensual relationships with him, yes. And the cop basically said, well, be careful who you go out with next time. And that was it, which is, there's really no way to describe how the rage of injustice that occurs when something like that happens to you. Of course, it wasn't over. He stalked me for 2 years. And I don't know how to explain what it feels like to be stalked. I can tell you that, you know, I can use those words you hear all the time about living life on eggshells. I do not have the words to tell you. You never rest. That's it. Like them. You never rest. Because what he did it, and now I know that it's what they all do. They take breaks. So just when you feel like, oh, it's been a month, maybe he stopped, they appear. And that's what he did. And he was great at it. He was terrific at it. He would, you know, by the time the police came, he would always be gone. They could never find him. I didn't know where he lived. It was just this ongoing, I mean, for 2 years, I've never in 2 years walked anywhere with someone with me. To work, back to the house, back to work. I didn't go out at night. You're a prisoner. He made me a prisoner. I have to tell you that was a long time ago. And even talking to you, even now, even after all my own therapy and all my years of working with others, it still causes a sensation in my stomach. You never forget it.
There we go. Oh,
There we go. Can people hear me now? No.
yes.
Okay, cool. So again, intense video, but an important one. So Valerie speaks a lot to the lasting effects that stalking can have on survivors. And as she said, years later, she still experiences like a visceral reaction to thinking about how it felt. So what can we as advocates do for the victims of stalking? One of the biggest things that we can do for people is validate. Stalkers can often be made to feel like they're going crazy. So for someone to just say, I believe you, can be huge. Another one is, oh my goodness. Is talking to them about their support system. So talk to them about the people in their network. You may be the first and only person that they have ever told about what's happening. People can sometimes feel ashamed or embarrassed about it. So encourage them to explore their comfort level around talking to family and friends. Next big one is documentation. And this is so important if the client wishes to pursue obtaining a protective order at any point. We like to say day, date, time, and elements of the crime for their stalking log, and encourage them to be as specific as possible with the details. Talk about saving messages and emails, and maybe even discuss how they might feel about setting up some security cameras around the outside of their house. And safety. So assessing the threat. Are things kind of staying the same, or are they getting worse over time? How would they feel about contacting law enforcement if they feared for their safety? And consider a stalking order. So a stalking order is a kind of protective order, and you can walk the client through what that process might look like if they're interested in one. Advocates can also assist with filling it out, either in person, and now that everything was kind of under lockdown, they also have the option to do e-filing. And advocates can accompany clients to their hearings if they want it. And you'll learn more about what that looks like in another training session. And some other options. So victims can often feel really, really overwhelmed, like almost to the point of paralysis. So helping them to discover where their lines are when it comes to contacting law enforcement or obtaining a protective order can alleviate some of that panic if and when that line is reached. Safety planning can also help survivors to feel more in control of the situation, and it can save lives. If again, talk about contacting the police if they feel like they're in imminent danger. Changing up their routine. So if they go to the same coffee shop every day, discuss finding a new one. Same thing with gyms and grocery stores. And it's unfair that someone should be made to change their entire life because of another person's actions, but avoiding their usual spots can have a positive effect on their sense of safety. So it would still be something that's important to talk about. Arranging a safe place to stay in an emergency. Make a plan with a friend to spend the night if they feel unsafe at home, or even booking a hotel room. Have friends or family accompany you on errands. Again, going through all of this effort is exhausting and unfair, but it can go a long way in giving some peace of mind. And telling others how they can help. So if they're comfortable, they could ask a coworker to inform security if they show up at work, or asking neighbors to call the police if they spot a certain vehicle on the street. And consider avoiding social media. And if that can't be done, encourage them to learn how to delete EXIF data from their photos. So EXIF data is the data that is stored, like the date and time on a photo. And it sometimes, depending on like if you took it with your phone, it catalogs the GPS location. And this data is incredibly easily accessible to everybody. And if they're being stalked by an intimate partner who like might have known some of their passwords, consider changing the passwords, change security questions to kind of like some false answers that they wouldn't be able to guess with the personal information that they have. Keep any personal documents that you have with you at all times or at a trusted person's house. There's unfortunately a lot more to worry about than the EXIF data and passwords when it comes to being stalked through technological means. So talk to clients about how to search for tracking apps on their phones and how to turn off their geolocators. Ask if it's possible that cameras have been hidden in their house or on their property. Let them know that there are certain kinds of spyware and keyboard loggers that can track the sites they visit and kind of keep track of like what they're searching for. Turn off geolocators in apps like Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. Snapchat's a big one. There's literally a little thing you can click and then it shows where all your friends are like on a map. It's crazy. Even smart home technology like Nest and stuff like that can be hacked by people who are really tech savvy. And then there were a few even more outlandish ways that stalkers have targeted their victims using technology. Like spyware in charging cords that tracked info on the phone that they like leave the charging cords or like give them to mutual children to use and then they get left around the house. Auto answer on phones that are left in people's houses or in their cars. So the way that auto answer works is a person will like, it's usually like a burner phone, like not a very good phone, and they'll just casually drop it like in the car, like under the seat or something like that. And then when they call that phone later, instead of ringing, it automatically picks up and it becomes like a microphone. Tracking apps can be loaded on phones, like I said in the last slide, but some people who are more tech savvy can change the icon so it looks like something totally innocuous, like a weather app or like a calculator. And then phone and text spoofing. So like you can create fake caller IDs so it looks like a friend or a family member's calling. And there's like voice changing apps and stuff so they can leave messages saying that like an important court appointment was canceled when it was in fact not. What am I doing? Here we go. So giving all this information to victims can help them a lot. Victims say how overwhelmed they feel. So eliminating some of those unknowns can be really, really helpful in making them feel like they've kind of regained some semblance of control, like a grip on their life. So we're gonna move on to sexual assault and I'm gonna chug water again.
Yeah, and while you drink, Sajan, I would just add, like one of the reasons to give you all this information is when we talk about validating, so many clients say to us, and even kids who talk to us at schools, right? They'll be like, it sounds crazy when I say this out loud, right? So the more we can validate and be like, no, we have absolutely seen and heard this before. Like we know this happens to other people. Mm-hmm. Like it makes them more comfortable sharing their story. Because if they think they sound crazy, they're not going to reach out for help. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I actually recently spoke to someone on the phone who was like, I sound insane, but I think there might be cameras in my house. And I was like, that's not insane. That happens to people. So it can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the sexual assault section. So we already talked a little bit about sexual violence being used as a means of power and control in domestic violence and intimate partner violence relationships, but I want to discuss it in a broader sense. So sexual assault is defined as forced, manipulated, or coerced sexual activity. It's a crime in which sex is the weapon. Also, any sexual contact with a minor, which is in the state of New Hampshire is 16, is also sexual assault. But not all sexual violence is sexual assault. So there's actually a continuum of sexual violence. So on the outside, it starts with things like sexual harassment, catcalling, flashing, things like that. Then sexual assault, which is what we just defined, and then rape, which is penetration. And some of these things are obviously more severe than others, but they're all sexual in nature and they're all unwanted. We know that in communities in which things like sexual harassment are happening and nothing's being done about it, it's really like a higher occurrence of the more severe forms of sexual violence. And that's not because everyone who catcalls is then going to like move up into being a sexual assault perpetrator. It's more about the messages that we're getting from our society And if people are like sexually harassing each other and it seems like no one cares, what message is that sending about how we as a whole feel about sexual violence? So for the next slide, I actually have a question for you all, and it's a really strange question to ask, but I'm just going to ask you to bear with me. Which one of these people do you think was a victim of sexual assault? So I'm just going to have you all use your fingers. So if you think it was number 1, just hold up a 1, 2, hold up 2. If you think it's more than one person, use multiple hands. I can't really see people, but Sarah can see people.
I can. So I see that we see some 5s.
Yeah.
Some 5s. Lots of 5s. And then we had a couple multiple hands.
Yeah. So I'm guessing,
Okay.
I'm just going to go ahead and guess that the people who were putting up 5s are not saying that only number 5 was a victim of sexual assault. And you are correct. They are all victims of sexual assault. And again, I know that this is a weird question to ask, but the reason we ask it is so that you can see that this can happen to anyone. And by the way, these are all real people with their real photos, and they're okay with their stories being told. So it can help raise awareness. And like I said, sexual assault can happen to anyone, regardless of age, gender, race, sexual orientation, ability, socioeconomic status. There are certain groups of people who are more vulnerable or who are targeted more often, like children and women of certain ages, but it can happen to absolutely anybody. And in addition to everyone being a victim of sexual assault, they all have something else in common. All of their abusers had more power than them, and power can come in many forms. It's not just physical size and strength. Like in Anthony's case, he was assaulted by multiple boys on his football team, and it was kind of for the purpose, it was like a hazing ritual that they did. So then there was also that power of like him feeling like he wanted to be a part of the team. And then in Florence's case, someone broke into her home in the middle of the night and sexually assaulted her. So not only were they young and able-bodied, whereas she was an elderly woman, but they had the element of surprise. And then with Olga, who you'll actually be watching a video on her on another training night, she was pretty savagely abused sexually and physically by her father and her brother when she was growing up. And she is like a motivational speaker and a lawyer now. And she does all these trainings with like police officers and other first responders on how to deal with victims of those types of violence, especially child victims. But in her case, that power was like, it was her family. And especially when you're a kid, you're kind of told that like your family is supposed to take care of you and protect you. In Jada's case, she was at a party and she was drugged and she was unconscious when multiple boys sexually assaulted her. So she had no power at all as an unconscious person. And in Heath's case, he was assaulted by some of his bunkmates, and he went to his commanding officer about it, and his commanding officer did nothing to help him. So in that case, it was kind of like that rank was the power there. And just so you know, Heath is now, like, again, a speaker. He goes all over the place to like military bases and talks about sexual assault in the military. So I said a few minutes ago that there are groups who are more vulnerable than others: women, people of color, people with disabilities, and children. And 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18. So there's a pretty large discrepancy between boys and girls due to a few factors. For one, it does happen to girls, boys, but only at a certain age. So before children hit the age of 10, it actually is just as likely to happen to boys as it is to girls. And it's not until they hit puberty that it happens. And also underreporting is a huge problem as well. And children aren't the only younger people to be targeted. So we're about to watch another video, but before we do, I want to give you some background information. So the video is based on a study that was done in 2002. So about 2,000 men in the general public were asked about acts of interpersonal violence. 120 of them self-reported acts that met legal definitions of rape or attempted rape, but they were never prosecuted. And a majority of them were repeat rapists, and they averaged about 6 rapes. So we're going to watch this video. Again, this is a reenactment of an actual interview that was particularly memorable. Let me do this thing first. Make sure everyone's muted.
Yep.
We had parties every weekend. That's what my fraternity was known for. And we'd invite a bunch of girls, lay out a bunch of kegs or whatever we were drinking that night, and everyone would just get plastered. And we'd all invite girls, all of us in the fraternity. You know, we'd be on the lookout for the good-looking girls, especially the freshmen, the really young ones. They were the easiest. It's like they didn't know the ropes, kind of, you know, like they were easy prey. And they wouldn't know anything about drinking or how much alcohol they could handle. So, you know, they wouldn't know anything about our techniques.
What were those techniques?
Well, we'd invite them to the party, you know, to make it seem like it was a real honor. Like we didn't just invite any girl, which I guess in a way is true. You know, and then we'd get them drinking right away. We'd have all those kegs, but we always had some kind of punch also, you know, like our own home brew. And we'd make it with a real sweet juice and just pour in all kinds of alcohol. And it was really powerful stuff. The girls wouldn't know it hit them. They'd be guzzling it, you know, because they were freshmen, kind of nervous, and it was just juice anyhow, right? So.
Well, when you say it was just juice, you mean the girls wouldn't know that it was spiked with alcohol?
Well, they knew. I mean, they knew that. At least the smart ones did. It was a party, right? Not some kind of, you know, like social tea. I think they must have known, or most of them did anyway. The ones that didn't had to have been really naive.
Well, did you count on them being naive?
Yeah, the real young ones, the naive ones were the easiest, and they'd be the ones that we'd target.
What do you mean by target?
Well, that's what we'd call them. You know, we'd all be scouting for targets during the week. You know, we'd pick them out, work them over during the week, and then get them all psyched up to come to one of our famous parties. They'd be the ones we'd really work on.
What would happen once they were drunk at the party?
Well, that's when one of us would make our move. You know, by then each one of the girls had been kind of staked out by one of us, meaning one of the guys would be working on them, getting them drinks, you know, keeping the juices flowing, so to speak. And you kind of had to know your moment, you know, when to make the move. You basically had to have an instinct for it.
Can you describe what happened in the specific occasion you referred to in your questionnaire?
Yeah, sure. I had this girl staked out. I picked her out in one of my classes, you know, worked on her. She was all prepped. I was watching for her, you know, and the minute she walked into the door of the party, I was on her. And she was really good looking too. You know, we started drinking together and I could tell she was nervous. I could tell she was nervous because, you know, she was drinking that stuff so fast.
What was she drinking?
Well, it was some kind of punch we'd made, you know, the usual thing.
Did she know it was spiked with alcohol?
I don't really know, although she must have after a while, you know, because she started to get plastered in just a few minutes. And, you know, so I started making my moves on her. I kind of leaned in close, you know, got my arm around her, and then at the right moment I kissed her, you know, moved in a little closer. You know, like the usual kind of stuff. I'm sure it was no surprise to her. She'd done it 1,000 times before, you know, and after a while, I asked her if she wanted to go up to my room, you know, get away from the noise, and she came right away. So, actually it wasn't my room. You know, we always had several rooms designated before the party, you know, that were all prepped for this.
Designated rooms?
Yeah, we'd set aside a few rooms, you know, bring the girls up to once they were ready.
What happened when you got to the designated room?
Well, she was really woozy by this time, so I brought up another drink, you know, and sat her down on one of the beds, sat down next to her, and pretty soon I just made my move. I don't remember exactly what I did first. I probably, you know, leaned her down on the bed, started working on her clothes, feeling her up.
How did she respond?
I don't remember. I started working her blouse off, you know, and I think she might have said something. I don't remember. I didn't expect her to get into it right away.
Did she say anything?
Yeah, at some point she started saying things like, you know, I don't want to do this right away or something like that. I just kept working on her clothes, you know, and she started squirming, but that actually helped because her blouse came off easier. And I kind of leaned on her, you know, kept feeling her up, get her more into it. And she tried to push me off, so I pushed her back down.
Were you angry?
No, but, you know, it pissed me off that she played along the whole way and then decided to squirm out of it like that at the end. I mean, she was so plastered, she probably didn't know what was going on anyway. I don't know. Maybe that's why she started pushing on me, but, you know, I just kept leaning on her, pulling off her clothes. And at some point she stopped squirming. I don't know. Maybe she passed out. Her eyes were closed.
What happened?
I fucked her.
Did you have to lean on her, hold her down when you did it?
Yeah, I had my arm across her chest like this, you know. That's how I did it.
Was she squirming?
Yeah, she was squirming, but not as much anymore.
What happened afterwards?
I got dressed and went back to the party.
What did she do?
She left.
You know, there are many things I think we can learn from this very disturbing interview. Most notably are some of Frank's terms, the language he uses. He uses words like prey, targets, staked out. These are all words that serve to dehumanize his victim, and they're the common language amongst criminals. It's also notable that Frank exhibits no empathy for his victim. At a time when she's experiencing extreme terror, his reaction is one of anger, not empathy for her state. He also minimizes his violence and sanitizes it. If you remember in that reenactment, he says that he put his arm across the top of her chest. What he really shows is his arm across the woman's windpipe, which is probably blocking off her breathing and undoubtedly causing her immense terror.
Okay. That was, like David said, a disturbing interview. And this video really helps to counter some of the myths that we have as a society about date rape, like that it's all just like a good evening gone wrong because of some alcohol, or it was just like a misunderstanding. There we go. Yeah, so that it's unplanned, good evening gone bad, due to both people being drunk, or it's a misunderstanding. These men planned their attack. They even referred to the women they invited to the parties as targets or prey. And they purposely used alcohol as a weapon, giving it to inexperienced drinkers and masking the taste so that they would drink more than they would have otherwise. I don't think that sounds like a misunderstanding at all. They also knew their victims. These men were educated and employed, came from diverse backgrounds. They weren't mentally ill. They almost never used weapons or inflicted visible injuries. They used psychological weapons like manipulation and threats, and then backed that up with physical force in the last moments. So oftentimes when I give presentations about consent to teenagers on the Seacoast, there will be like at least one person who says, but what about the people who lie? They hook up, and then after they tell people that it was rape, and that happens all the time. How do I protect myself? Well, let's look at some figures. The average percentage of false reports of sexual assault are around 2 to 10%. And that number is actually way closer to 2% because they count reports that are withdrawn for any reason as false reports. And there are a lot of reasons why a victim might withdraw a report, like pressure from friends and family, fear of retaliation from the perpetrator, and even like harassment. And the average percentage of false report for other crimes is 2 to 10%. So we tell kids that they shouldn't be worried about being the victim of a false report. They're much, much more likely to be a victim of a sexual assault. And when someone has been sexually assaulted, it's very unlikely that they'll make a report at all. So 63% of all rapes are never reported. Why is this? So to help us find out, I would like to do an activity. So this is usually done by writing it down, but I don't think we have time, and everyone probably doesn't have paper, so we'll just do it out loud. So I'm going to give everyone 30 seconds to think about each thing. And at the end of the 30 seconds, I'll ask for a volunteer to tell me about that thing. So for the first one is, what was the best meal or your favorite food that you've ever had? I'll give you 30 seconds to think about it, and then I'll ask for someone to tell me about it. Or maybe less than 30 seconds, because that's... Okay. Does anyone want to tell me about their favorite food? It is dinner time.
I know.
The best slice of New York pizza ever.
New York pizza is the only pizza in my
Oh.
like Chicago style pizza. Okay, so the next one is best trip or the best vacation or staycation that you've ever had. I'll give you like 10 seconds and then someone can tell me about that time.
3 weeks sailing.
We're not allowed to travel anymore.
Down east.
What was that?
A 3-week sailing trip in Casco Bay and going up to Bar Harbor.
Oh my goodness, that sounds amazing.
Oh, it was the
Sailing
best
trip.
ever. Yeah, that was a
Sounds-
neat one.
That sounds wonderful.
It was.
Okay, last one. Best sexual experience you've ever had. I'll give you 10 seconds. Now, before anyone volunteers, I would like for people who would feel uncomfortable telling this group of near strangers about their best sexual experience to raise their hands. And it's okay if you're not raising your hand because everyone's different. But a lot of people feel uncomfortable about that. So what were the reactions that came up for people when I asked you to think about this, knowing that I might ask someone to share? Like what feelings did you experience? What was that process like for you?
Like a little bit of anxiety, like should I share that? Or like, I don't know if I'm gonna feel good about that after, so maybe I won't share, or I don't know, like hesitation.
Yeah, absolutely. So think about this. Hold on. I was asking people to share their best, and people felt hesitant because it's a very personal question, and this is a group of near strangers. Can you imagine what it would feel like to have to tell some strangers about your worst sexual experience and potentially one of the worst experiences, period, of your life? So has this changed your understanding of what it might be like for a sexual abuse survivor to come forward? Yeah, definitely. So let's break down why survivors might not tell. Just skipped all that, I guess. Yeah, so this is just saying our job as advocates is not to pressure anyone to disclose what happened to them to police or to lawyers or even to their friends and family, because that's really up to them when they feel ready to tell people about that. We're there to support them in that decision, and that's our job as advocates. So why survivors don't report? Concern about not being believed is probably the #1 reason why survivors don't tell. Not fitting that victim stereotype, the perpetrator being well-liked in the community or in their friend group, and the false reporting mythos that just like lives in our society all contribute to feelings of they might not be believed. Fear of retaliation from the attacker, be it physical retaliation or like slander, which happens a lot. Shame, self-blame, or fear of being blamed by others. I feel like this often comes up with people who were like doing something they shouldn't have been doing when they were attacked, like underage drinking or something like that. Or if they weren't doing one of the many things that we are told as women that we need to do to protect ourselves from assault, like dressing modestly or watching your drink. Victim blaming is a massive problem in our society, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Pressure from others not to tell. And this can come up, like I said, when that perpetrator is like well-liked, or if they're like an important person in the community, or to their friends or family, like if he's a football star about to go to college on a scholarship, that sends a message that the perpetrator's happiness is more important than the victim's life. Feeling like there might not be enough evidence. So there's often not a huge amount of evidence to begin with, especially if they didn't go straight to the hospital or to a police station, which most people don't. There might not be physical evidence, so that can be a huge deterrent for victims as the burden of proof is placed. And desire to protect the attacker. This is true a lot with like intimate partner violence. We hear people on the hotline say all the time when the topic of reporting comes up, I don't want to ruin their life. And they still care about or even love their abuser. And it's important to respect that. When it comes up, just assure the client that their wants and needs are just as important as their abusers, and they deserve to get help and feel safe. And it can help alleviate that feeling of like, I'm gonna ruin their life. And distrust of law enforcement or the criminal justice system. Historically speaking, law enforcement has not been very supportive of victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. There have been instances of police officers being dismissive or even blaming victims for what someone else did to them. The good news is that Haven does a lot of trainings with police and even judges in the area. We have a really good working relationship with all the local law enforcement, but people may still be distrustful of that, and that's still completely valid. We as advocates work under the VEAS model, which I'm not sure if do they know about VEAS yet?
We haven't gotten to that yet, no.
No,
Okay,
but
so
you
you're
can
gonna learn
tell
about
them.
VEAS. It's
You can tell them, you can introduce it.
Yeah, so it's validate, educate, empower, and support. And so we work under that model. And when working under that model, we need to respect clients' wishes around making a report and support the feelings behind the decisions that they're making for themselves. We know it can be very, very difficult for anyone to talk about being assaulted, but for all the reasons that we just discussed. But some people say that male victims might face some unique barriers when it comes to talking about their assault. And part of that is they don't want to appear weak or vulnerable. Men in our society are unfortunately told that they need to be a certain way in order to be a real man. And that includes like being powerful and in charge and not allowed to display emotions other than anger. It's not based in reality and it's not fair, but it's unfortunately the case. So being the victim of a sexual assault means that someone took power away from you, and that might be particularly difficult to talk about for male survivors. Worried about what others will say about their sexual orientation. So we know that most men would never sexually assault anybody, but of the people who do commit sexual assault, most of them are men. So statistically speaking, if a man is sexually assaulted, it's often by another man. And some men say that they're worried about rumors about their sexual orientation. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with being gay, but no one likes to be gossiped about, especially after going through the trauma of a sexual assault. Sexual assault has nothing to do with sexual orientation. It has nothing to do with attraction. It's all about power and control and humiliation. It's not about sex. Sex is just the weapon. Yep, I already said that. So there are definitely some long-term effects of sexual violence. They're all here. Flashbacks, PTSD, disassociation, self-harm, eating disorders, effects on relationships, substance misuse, risk of STIs and pregnancy like right after the assault. That sounds like a lot, and it sounds like very fire and brimstone and like nothing's ever gonna be okay again. But I really liked what both Valerie and Leslie said, where yes, these long-term effects are possible and a lot of people do deal with them, but people who go through this aren't like ruined or broken after. They are completely capable of having fulfilling, loving lives after. And that's part of what we do, is kind of clearing the path for people to be able to have that after these things happen to them. We're gonna move on to consent. So I actually do this presentation for teenagers all over the Seacoast. I changed it a little bit so that it's not like I'm talking to you like you're 17, because that would be weird. But I think it's a really, really important thing that we do, because obviously we support people who have already been affected by violence. But as a violence prevention educator, and Sarah as well, like we want to stop it from happening in the first place. And I think that this presentation is really, really important for kids to listen to. So what is consent? It's permission to do something. And we need consent for lots of things, like even simple things like borrowing a pencil from a neighbor or a friend. But when we're talking about it in the context of sexual activity, it's more than just permission. We say that consent is FRIES, freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. So this is actually Planned Parenthood's definition of consent, and we really, really like it because it's like very all-encompassing. When we talk about freely given, we mean without pressure, threat, manipulation, or force. Yes and no need to be equal and safe answers. Obviously, if someone's being forced to do something, that's not consent. But the other ones can be less obvious. Like a threat doesn't necessarily mean a threat of physical violence. It could be a threat to leave or a threat to spread rumors or post pictures about somebody. Manipulation would be making another person feel guilty, making them feel like you owe them sex or you owe them something about your body, or if you really loved me, you would do this. And we know that that's not how love works. Love and sex are not the same thing, and equating the two are not fair. And pressure, I think I skipped pressure. That could just be something as simple as like asking over and over and over and over again. Reversible, it's always okay to change your mind. And it happens all the time where someone might say they want something, and then when it starts happening, they realize that they actually didn't. And it's okay to change your mind in the middle of something happening. It would be really, really important for the other person to respect that and stop what's happening immediately. Informed, that's just another way of saying that everyone knows what is happening. And it's really hard for someone to know what's happening if they're asleep or if they are intoxicated. And obviously, we're not saying that every time people engage in sexual activity when someone's intoxicated, it's sexual assault, because that's not the case. Adults do it all the time. But if someone is too drunk to drive, we usually say that they're too drunk to give their consent. Or if someone is like falling all over themselves or getting sick or stumbling over their words, probably not. Enthusiastic. You don't have to be jumping up and down like these little cartoon people, but it just means that it's something that you actually want to do. It's not something that you feel obligated to do. And specific. Some people are okay with some things and not all things. And that specificity is ongoing. Like if someone does something one time, it doesn't mean that they want to do it every time or even ever again. And that's completely fine. There we go. Silence and a lack of resistance do not signify consent. Consent needs to be affirmative. So instead of thinking of consent as no means no, it can be really helpful to think of it as only yes means yes. And drugs and alcohol don't excuse unwanted sexual activity. And this is pointed at perpetrators, not at victims. Like if someone were to choose to drunk drive and a police officer pulled them over and you said, "I'm sorry, officer, I'm drunk. I can't be held responsible for my actions." That's not going to fly. You're still going to get a DUI and get arrested. And the same thing applies to assault. So why don't people just say no? There are a lot of reasons. Fear can definitely be a factor. If yes and no are not equal and safe answers, it can be difficult to say no. When people feel awkward and uncomfortable, people deal with that discomfort in all different ways. I'm a nervous laugher. Some people shut down or fidget really bad or can't make eye contact. And if someone's feeling awkward, it might be hard for them to express themselves. And worrying about another person's feelings. I feel like this one's really important and like completely overlooked. Most people are empathetic and they might be worried about making someone else feel bad or rejected. Like let's say they do like that person, but they're not ready to be physical yet, or they're just like not in the mood right at that moment. Saying no can feel harsh. So they might say no in other ways to kind of like soften the blow. And we call those no messages. And I want to talk about those. Messages and actions that mean no. Things like, I don't know, or I'm not ready, or I've had too much to drink, or I need to go home. And then things like cringing or crying, or kind of doing body language that makes it seem like they're not into it. Moving away, looking down, lack of eye contact. Those are all no messages, and those all make sense to everybody, right? Yeah. So we're gonna watch another video. It's one of my personal favorites. This man makes an excellent comparison with consent and making tea. You've probably seen it because it was all over the internet, but it's like my absolute favorite. I'm gonna change this again. Everybody mute.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, yes, please, that's kind of you. And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, do you want tea? Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, but you wanted tea last night. If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Yay. There we go. Yeah, that's like one of my favorite videos on the internet. I think it's adorable and hilarious. And it just like makes you think of how ridiculous it is that we can't like wrap our heads around it as a society with sex, but it's so easy once you put it into the context. So these were just the key messages we went through. I just want to focus on the last one, which is that the victim is never to blame. Oftentimes victims are told either directly or like more subliminally that what happened to them is their fault. Maybe what they were wearing is called into question, or their judge of character, or the way they responded to being hurt. But when we take the victim blaming narrative and we apply it to other crimes, it seems ridiculous. So let's watch it in action. Another video.
Here's your tea. Are you feeling a bit better?
Not really, no.
Okay, well, can you describe the man who mugged you?
He was about 5'10", short dark hair. He put a knife to my throat and he demanded my phone and my watch.
And were you wearing what you're wearing now?
Sorry?
Is this what you were wearing when it happened?
Yes, but...
You look quite provocatively wealthy.
Look, I failed to see how what I wear has any
Well, just a bit of an invitation, isn't it? Like you're advertising it. Look, you seem distressed. I'm going to bring one of our counsellors in. This gentleman's a bit upset. He was mugged earlier.
Oh, dear. Had you been drinking?
Yes, because if you'd had a drink, it can send out confusing signals. Lead somebody on with a nice suit and the phone, and then at the last minute say, I don't want to be mugged.
He put a knife to my throat and he demanded my possessions.
And you just gave them to him.
Did you even scream?
See, how is somebody to know that you don't enjoy handing over your possessions unless you make your intentions clear?
No, I didn't scream. He had a knife. I was really scared.
And we're very sympathetic, but I'm afraid you're going to have to accept some of the responsibility for this. Come in.
Are you going to be much longer? I've got a gentleman out here who says he's been receiving abusive emails for months.
Ask him what font he's been using. If it's something coquettish like Helvetica, then he's probably brought it on himself.
Right, okay.
Okay. So obviously that was made to be funny, and it is very funny. But the reason it's funny is because those are all things that people say to victims of sexual assault all the time, but when you put it into the context of another crime, it's completely insane. So why do people blame the victim for this crime, but not for other ones? We think part of the problem is like, ooh, here we go, this thing that we call the just world hypothesis. People like to operate in a way that like makes sense to them. And if bad things happen to good people for no reason, then the world can seem a lot scarier. People like to believe that they can protect themselves from whatever comes their way. We've all probably heard someone say like, well, that would never happen to me because I would fight back, would never walk alone at night, don't go on blind dates, don't drink around strangers, all these reasons. But we know that sexual assault can happen to anyone. And even if someone does everything right, they can still experience sexual violence. What I mean by this last one, trauma can cause counterintuitive reactions. You're all familiar with the flight or fright response, correct? Yeah. But there's actually another response when people are in danger that oftentimes people don't talk about or know about. It also begins with the letter F. Does anyone know what that is?
Freeze. Freeze.
It is freeze. Yep. The freeze response isn't talked about as often as the first two. It might be because it's like not as exciting, or because most people would like to assume that they would either fight or run away when in a dangerous situation. By the way, these responses are not voluntary. They're automatic responses that your body makes. So there really isn't a way to know like ahead of time what a person might do. And when a person freezes, they might look totally frozen, like almost paralyzed. But another kind of freeze response is actually more common. Instead of being completely frozen, a person might have difficulty problem solving or making decisions. Motor skills would suffer. So I always think about like horror films when you see someone being chased by an axe murderer and they're like running and there's no obstacles in their way, but they're like falling all over themselves, or like a door is clearly unlocked, but they're like struggling to open it. That's a form of freeze. And it seems counterintuitive that people respond to danger in this way, but it's actually the body's way of trying to preserve itself and minimize damage. And again, it's not a conscious reaction. So oftentimes people will call the hotline and they'll say things like, why didn't I run away? Why didn't I fight back? Or why did I do those things? I made it worse. And what we tell victims when they call the hotline and say that is, whatever you did in the moment to be here the next day sharing your story with us was the right thing to do. The problem isn't the way that your body responded to being hurt. The problem is that someone chose to hurt you. I don't feel like we have time to do this wrap up of talking points. It's everything that I just said, honestly. Yep. So if anyone has any questions, you are free to stay and ask those questions. We went a little bit longer than I originally thought because
technology.
Yeah,
I know.
Okay. I'm sharing my screen now. Stop share. Oh, there's everyone's face. I've only seen like 2 faces the whole time.
Yay.
Yay. Okay. Any questions? Not just about the consent stuff, but about anything that we talked about. Let's look back through the chat. Nope, nobody.
I've also heard of fawn. Have you heard that before?
Yes, absolutely. Sarah, do you want to talk more about that one?
Yeah, that and that one has like a couple of different names. Sometimes it's called an affiliate response. Sometimes it's called a flock response. What's really interesting about that response and in particular, I'm most familiar with the flock response, is that the first thing that people do when they're in danger is they look for other people around them to keep them safe. If you ever went to a haunted house with me, you would know that because I would be behind you. But like, but in the absence of other people to keep them safe, that's when these other responses kick in. And also, like, frequently people will choose to fawn over or affiliate with their abuser because that is the only way to remain safe. And that's more typical in abusive relationships where they have a relationship with the person that's ongoing when they don't have the ability to be away from them. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's all part of those mechanisms that we subconsciously use, like to protect ourselves. Yeah.
Anybody else? I know today was a lot of just like me talking at you rather than the other day when it was like much more interactive. So your brains have probably partially shut off at this point, but if you can think of anything from any point during the discussion, feel free to ask. And also it's past 8, so anyone who wants to leave can leave unless Kyla or Sarah have parting words. People, but if it's the last day with questions, you can.
I do. It was a lot of information tonight, and I know you probably are all very tired, but if you start to process it and things come up for you, tonight until 9:30, you can call my personal cell phone. I know I think you all have both of my numbers? Yes, thumbs up. I think I sent them in an email. You can call myself till 9:30 tonight, and also night staff who is on is Hannah B. And I asked if she would be willing to be available. So if you have a pen and paper, I can give you her phone number. And I'll let you guys, if you need to talk to either of us, that's fine. Her phone number is 603-770-0831. It is also in your resource guide under Hannah B. There's the important phone numbers in the beginning. And I think both of mine are in there as well. So if you guys need to talk tonight or even tomorrow you can just call myself and I'll be available.
And I would also just put out there, so you guys all have the super cute doodle notebooks that we gave you if you want to take notes. If you think of things that are kind of confusing or you want re-explained or were surprising to you, like as you process, so maybe not emotionally upsetting, but things you want to sort of unpack, we are going to have a little bit of a lunch chat on Saturday. So there might be some space for that then too. So just write it in your notebooks so you'll have it with you and we'll try to revisit that.
Mm-hmm. And just to recap, the power and control wheel is in your resource guide, and also the little cycle of abuse is also in there. And there is an explanation of VEES in there, the VEES that we use as advocates. If you want to take a look at that, you're welcome to. We will visit that a little more later on though. So, yeah. Any other questions?
No, but I just want to say that was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.